Alright, we are back with a new video, and in the lead up to the Survivor 42 finale, I decided to make a special video and rank each final 3 scenario based on how likely it is to happen, as well as forecast how I think the jury votes would go if that scenario were to happen. Now, I've already done this for Australian Survivor a couple months ago, as well as Survivor 41 on my other channel when that finale is rolling around, and it's always a fun video that I like to make, so, I'm doing it again for this season. So, as of recording this, there are 5 players left in the game, those being Jonathan, Lindsay, Marianne, Mike, and Romeo. And with there being a final 3, that means that there are 10 possible final tribal scenarios that can happen. And again, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to happen and who would win each of those scenarios. So, it'll be interesting to run down. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final 3 that I think is the least likely to happen is Jonathan versus Lindsay versus Romeo. Now, I should say up front that I think a lot of this is based off the edit and who I think is likely to get to the end, but I also factor in gameplay and how I think this scenario is likely to happen. So the reason I think this scenario is unlikely to happen is because, one, it includes Lindsay, someone who I think is going to be targeted at the next opportunity, but it also includes Jonathan, who I assume would be the backup target if Lindsay were to win out somehow. So obviously that makes for a pretty unlikely final 3. I don't really see Romeo flipping on Marianne. And while Mike could vote to save Jonathan, I don't think he would necessarily vote to save Lindsay. So again, this leads to a very unlikely scenario of 3 people who are unlikely to get to the end based on the current edit, but also unlikely based on the contenders. But if this scenario were to happen, I think this is a pretty clear Lindsay win, where first up, I think Lindsay gets the votes of Chanel, Roxroy, Tori, Hai, Omer. That's enough for a win right there. Drea could vote for Romeo, but I assume she would lean Lindsay, as I assume she sees Lindsay as the better player. Now, I do think the others could get some votes. I think Marianne is a possible vote for Romeo in this scenario, as we have seen them being in a pretty good relationship, with the two of them talking about being underdogs for a lot of it. And I think Mike could be a vote for Jonathan, maybe, but I am assuming Lindsay is the favorite coming into this. But considering I don't think Lindsay's even likely to get the final tribal, let alone with Jonathan, I don't think this scenario is likely, and because of that, I have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another pretty unlikely scenario, one that's pretty similar to the one we just mentioned, and here we have Jonathan versus Lindsay versus Mike. And the reason I have this one above the one with Romeo is that I think Mike is a bit more likely to get to the end than Romeo is, and plus I think there is a potential path there with Mike having a solid relationship with Jonathan. I could see him aligning with Jonathan, wanting to protect him, and through that they could potentially ride until the end together, where I don't feel like Mike has that same relationship with Romeo, who in turn is closer to Marianne. So again, I still think this scenario is pretty unlikely, as it doesn't have who I consider the pretty clear frontrunner to win based on my previous power ranking. However, if this scenario were to happen, I think Lindsay wins unanimously. Now, the one question is Roxroy, as I think Roxroy could vote for Mike or Jonathan depending on how Final Tribal goes, but I think even he admits that Lindsay has played the better game and has probably seen Lindsay being in the driver's seat for longer. So even then, I feel like Roxroy could vote for Lindsay there. But if we're looking at all the other votes, I feel like Lindsay should have them pretty locked up. I mean, Chanel has a pretty bad relationship with Mike. I mean, she's one of the people that has called him emotional. Same thing with Hai. I mean, Tori, I don't see Tori voting for Jonathan, so there's that. And then the others, Drea, Omer, Marianne, Romeo, I assume they all see Lindsay as the better player and would vote for her to win. So again, this scenario would still lead to a pretty dominant Lindsay win, and because of that, I have it here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and again, we have another pretty unlikely scenario, at least based on how I'm reading the situation. But here we have Lindsay versus Mike versus Romeo. And the reason I have this one above the ones we just mentioned is that unlike those other scenarios, this one does not have both Jonathan and Lindsay, as I feel like those two are very likely going to be the next targets depending on who wins that final 5 immunity. But here we can at least assume that Lindsay wins out from this point and gets to the end against two people that are not Jonathan, so there's that. And I feel like Lindsay, again, should be the favorite coming into this. I feel like she would have the locked votes of Chanel, Tori, Hai, Omer, and possibly Drea. And now again, Drea could vote for Romeo. However, I don't think it's a guarantee. Now I do think Marianne would vote for Romeo in the scenario, so there's that. But then there's Jonathan and Roxroy, who I think could be Mike votes. I mean, I don't think it's a guarantee per se. I mean, they could still end up voting for Lindsay. However, I think they could lean Mike depending on the final tribal performance. But again, Lindsay should be the favorite coming into this. And again, it's not too surprising or interesting, although there are, to be fair, more opportunities for there to be some rogue votes. But this scenario is here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have a seemingly similar scenario, however, one that leads to a very different outcome. But here we have Jonathan versus Mike versus Romeo. And again, this is a pretty similar scenario to the Lindsay one, where instead of Lindsay winning out, now we have Jonathan winning out. And again, somehow getting the votes against Marianne at some point to ensure that this final 3 happens. However, I have no idea what happens in this scenario. I don't know who wins, as I feel like the votes here are just all over the place. I mean, first up we have Chanel, who again doesn't seem that close to any of them. I mean, we obviously know that she wasn't a huge Jonathan fan out there, and she was especially not a Mike fan out there. So is she going to vote for Romeo? I don't know. Then we get to Roxroy, who I assume is a Mike vote in this scenario. I mean, possibly Jonathan, but certainly one of those two. Then we get to Tori, who, again, I have no idea where she's voting. She's definitely not voting for Jonathan. However, does she still vote for Romeo? I mean, I don't think she would see Romeo as that great of a player, but we do know that they at least had a good relationship out there. But then again, I mean, I don't think she votes for Mike either. So again, I did put her down as a Romeo vote, but it's very uncertain there. Hai is all over the place as well. I don't think he really sees any of these people as good players. I mean, Jonathan and Mike, I mean, I don't really see how he votes for them. And then Romeo, I mean, yes, they did have a bond, but I think even he would recognize that Romeo didn't play the best game out of them. So again, that's tough. I do think Drea is a clear Romeo vote. I do think she probably leans Romeo above everyone else. Then we get to Omer and Lindsay and Marianne in the scenario, the remaining Takus. Now, again, I do think Marianne does vote for Romeo, so there's that. But then there's Omer and Lindsay, and I would assume they would vote for Jonathan. However, it's very unclear. I mean, I don't think either of them see Jonathan as having played that great of a game. And I'm pretty sure they would wish they could vote for someone else. However, they just have to roll with that. So basically, based on these votes, it seems like Romeo has more locked votes, or at least based on this forecast. However, it is very much up in the air. And I don't really know where a lot of these people would go. So it's pretty unclear who would win. If I had to guess, I guess Romeo would win. However, again, with it being so uncertain, I figured number 7 is about as high as it can put this. Now we're moving on to number 6, and in case you couldn't tell, the remaining scenarios all involve Marianne in them. And considering how I see Marianne as the clear favorite to win at this point, it would make sense that all of the more likely scenarios, at least for this video, involve her in them. So there's that. However, at number 6, the least likely final 3 to involve Marianne in it is Jonathan versus Lindsay versus Marianne. And we're going right back to the issue I had at the 10 and 9 spots, where this final 3 has both Jonathan and Lindsay in the end, which I do not think is likely based on how I think the game is going. But again, it has Marianne in it, so there's that. And I think in this scenario, I think Marianne would win. I feel like she would have the locked votes of Roxroy, Hai, Drea, and Romeo. Now, Omer is a bit up in the air as, again, from what we saw on his way out, he does seem to respect Marianne a great amount for orchestrating the move to get him out. However, he was also closer to Lindsay for a lot of it, or at least strategically he was closer to Lindsay. Now, obviously, he had a pretty good relationship with both of them, but I would assume that he would see Lindsay as having been more integral to his game, being more integral to his alliances throughout. And through that, I could see him voting for Lindsay. However, if we're assuming that Marianne does some impressive maneuvers in the end game, then I could still see him voting for Marianne. Or if he figures that the rest of the jury is voting for Marianne, I could see him also going along with that. So there's that. Tori's sort of on a similar boat where, again, she does seem to have a pretty good relationship with both of them. I would assume Tori sees Lindsay as the better player. However, I could definitely see her voting for Marianne depending on Final Tribal and also just her sensing where the rest of the jury is going. And then we get to Chanel, who Chanel's kind of the inverse of Omer, where again, she does have a good relationship with both of them, and I could definitely see her voting for Marianne, especially if we're fitting into the storyline, and especially if Marianne is able to make some impressive moves in these last couple of rounds. However, I should note that in her exit interview, she talked about Lindsay as being the player she was rooting for the most, which does make things a little bit tricky. However, again, I feel like realistically, in the more likely scenario, she would vote for Marianne. But obviously, those are scenarios that don't have Lindsay in them. But in a scenario where with both Lindsay and Marianne, I would assume she's more up in the air. However, she could definitely be persuaded to vote for Marianne, so there's that. And then finally, there's Mike, who I think could be a vote for Jonathan, so at least there's that. However, I feel like Marianne is by far the favorite coming into a jury vote, so there's that. However, it's the fact that this scenario has both Jonathan and Lindsay in it that makes me think it's less likely, and therefore I have it here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have a bit of a more interesting scenario to talk about, and here we have Lindsay versus Marianne versus Romeo. And the reason I have this one lower is because I assume Lindsay is in more danger coming into this next round than Jonathan is, but that's just how it is. But obviously in this scenario, she would win out and obviously get to the end with people that she probably perceives as lesser threats. So there's that. Maybe Marianne wins against fire making, so there's that. But obviously in this scenario, I think Marianne would still win. Now, obviously, you have Chanel and Omer, who are definitely up in the air, could vote either way, depending on how the end game plays out, but also based on how Final Tribal plays out. However, again, I think Marianne would have by far more locked votes. I feel like she would have the locked votes of Roxroy, Tori, Hai, Drea, and Mike, whereas Jonathan would probably vote for Lindsay in this scenario. Again, if we're assuming that Lindsay wins out, I could definitely see him respecting Lindsay as a competitor, and through that, again, award the win to someone he sees as a bigger competitor. That, and also, I don't think he really respects Marianne too much at the end of the day, and same thing with Romeo. So there's that. But I still think Marianne would have more locked votes and would probably win pretty handily. So because of that, I have this scenario here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have a pretty similar scenario to talk about, just swapping out one person. But here we have Lindsay versus Marianne versus Mike. And this one is a bit more up in the air as, again, obviously you have Marianne getting more of the locked votes there. I feel like the same dynamic would play out with a lot of these. It doesn't really change much from the scenario with Romeo in it. Now, the one difference could be with Mike. I mean, I think Jonathan is maybe a bit more likely to vote for Mike than he is for Romeo, but I still think the votes would break out largely the same way, leading to a Marianne win. And because of that, I had the scenario here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we have another pretty likely scenario for me, but here we have Jonathan versus Marianne versus Romeo. And the reason I have this one so high is because, again, I feel like Jonathan is more likely to get the final tribal than Lindsay based on their edits, but also their current game position. And I feel like Jonathan could very well win out and get to this point. However, I feel like it would not go well for Jonathan. I feel like this, again, would lead to a very definitive Marianne win, getting the locked votes of Chanel, Roxroy, Hai, Drea, Omer, and Lindsay. Now, Jonathan would probably get Mike's vote, and I could see Romeo potentially getting Tori's vote, but however, I feel like even then, Tori might vote for Marianne anyway. So again, it's a pretty lopsided vote. Again, could be unanimous. However, I think there are definitely opportunities for the others to get some votes here. And because of that, I had the scenario here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we have a bit of an interesting scenario to discuss here. And here we have Jonathan versus Marianne versus Mike. And again, I assume this one is pretty likely, again, assuming Jonathan wins out, Mike sticks by his side. And we could see a Marianne Romeo fire making challenge, if I'm being perfectly honest here. Obviously, Marianne would have to win that, and then through that, she would get to the end. And I feel like Marianne wins unanimously in this scenario, as I don't feel like there's a single juror that would really consider voting for anyone else. Now, again, Roxroy could vote for Mike. I mean, Lindsay could vote for Jonathan, but although even then, I don't think it's that likely. However, I feel like everyone else in this scenario would be pretty locked. Marianne votes. Even if Marianne doesn't go to fire in this scenario, I still feel like, based on their relationships and perceptions, I feel like Marianne would easily win this jury vote. So because of that, I have the scenario here at number 2. And now at number 1, the final 3 scenario I think is the most likely to happen is Marianne versus Mike versus Romeo. And I feel like this one's the most likely because it requires the least amount of winning challenges in order to happen. As again, I feel like Lindsay and Jonathan would need to win out if they have any shot of getting to the end, and at least in Jonathan's case, most likely to lose. Again, I feel like Lindsay's most likely to go out at 5, and then at 4, I think Jonathan could very well go out and fire. I mean, I feel like that would be a very poetic end to his story on the season, and through that, we would get to this natural final 3. And similar to the scenario number 2, I feel like Marianne would easily win this scenario. Now, granted, I don't think it would be unanimous. I think Jonathan would probably vote for Mike in this scenario, as, again, I don't really see Jonathan voting for Marianne in a lot of situations, but I feel like everyone else would clearly vote for Marianne in this situation, especially over Mike and Romeo. Again, 2 of the people with the not greatest perceptions in the world on this jury, so there's that. And again, I feel like with Marianne being the most likely winner, I feel like this is a very likely scenario to happen. And with all the other players to consider, like Mike and Romeo, with Mike, again, not really being set up for a downfall, at least not before Final Tribal. And even with Romeo and his storyline earlier in the season of him wanting to prop up a female player, I know at the time it seemed like Drea would be that player he would prop up. However, with him aligning with Marianne and the post-merge, with both of them being underdogs, and then being on board with this latest Omer blindside, I feel like that storyline has clearly set up for him to be propping up Marianne. And through that, I feel like it would make sense for him to get to the end with Marianne based on that storyline, where again, he would most likely lose, but again, I would at least fit with the story. So I feel like based on the edit and based on how I see the rest of this game playing out, I feel like this is the most likely Final 3 scenario to happen, and the one that would lead to a Marianne win. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now again, I will be back after the season ends to do a review and player ranking, same thing as I have done with these other series that I've covered, so stay tuned for that. Obviously the Circle's wrapping up next week, so I do have some videos planned for some Circle postseason, so stay tuned for that, and some more general Survivor videos coming in the near future, so stay tuned for all of that as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.